Imagine waking up in a world where reading a book could get you burned alive, where complimenting a king's clothing slightly wrong could cost you your head, where owning the wrong bird, wearing the wrong color, or even sneezing in church might end in flames. And I'm not talking metaphorically. This was medieval Europe. And it wasn't just brutal, it was absurdly brutal. A place where the line between justice and hysteria was thinner than the parchment scribes bled over, where surviving an execution was considered a crime in itself, and where the law didn't just punish what you did, punished what you wore, what you said, what you read, and even what you didn't say. So before we go any further, take a breath, because we're about to journey back to a time when life, death, and power were governed by fear, suspicion, and superstition so intense it made survival an act of luck more than logic. And no matter how shocking these laws sound, know this: they were real, they were enforced, and for thousands they were fatal. So if you think today's rules are strict, wait until you see what got people executed in the Middle Ages, not for rebellion or murder, but for crimes that feel like satire, except they weren't. And we begin not with bloodshed, but with books. Because in a world where literacy meant danger, opening a page was like lighting a fuse, the kind that ended with fire and rope and silence. And the strange truth is, books weren't feared for what they said, they were feared for what they might make people think. And in an age when power depended on control, thought itself became a threat. And so the reader, the writer, the copier, all were targets, all were threats, all were disposable. So let's open the first chapter in this disturbing catalogue of punishable absurdities, where knowledge wasn't power, it was poison in parchment. 1. Reading forbidden books. Simply owning, reading, or copying banned books, especially those questioning church doctrine, was considered heresy and could lead to execution by burning. Literacy itself became dangerous, particularly for women and scribes. Surprise searches and banned book lists made medieval book ownership a deadly risk. There's a bitter irony in realizing that during the Middle Ages, the mere act of reading an activity we now associate with freedom, education, and enlightenment could be interpreted as rebellion, heresy, even treason, because the written word had power, not just poetic or intellectual power, but literal, dangerous, state-destabilizing power. And the ruling elites, both church and crown, knew it, feared it, and sought to control it with ruthless precision. So when a person was caught with a forbidden text, there was no courtroom drama, no debate over freedom of expression, no leniency for curiosity or good intentions. There was fire, always fire, the purifying kind that promised to cleanse not just the soul, but the page and the idea it carried. And the danger wasn't in writing alone, it was in copying, in owning, in reading, even in being literate enough to understand what the book said, because guilt didn't require action, only association. And if your hands bore ink or your eyes knew Latin or Greek, you were already suspect. A possible spreader of infection, because that's how they saw it. Forbidden ideas were treated like plagues, like diseases that traveled from one mind to another with catastrophic speed. And in a society built on obedience to divine order, any challenge to scripture or royal decree was a form of contagion. So they didn't just burn books, they made sure the people holding them burned too. And it gets worse, because some of these banned books weren't even subversive in obvious ways. They were philosophical texts, early scientific theories, or even translations of scripture not authorized by the church. So a priest with the wrong copy of the Bible could find himself condemned for undermining divine authority, which sounds paradoxical but made perfect sense in a world where truth wasn't what was provably, was what was approved. And perhaps the darkest layer of this literary inquisition was that women, especially literate women, were disproportionately targeted because a reading woman was a woman who might think, and a woman who might think was a woman who might question, and questioning women had no place in a system that already saw them as suspicious by default. So female scribes, midwives with herbal texts, nuns with theological commentaries, they were all vulnerable, not because they rebelled, but because they read. And the system needed no more reason than that. And so, a society that feared ideas turned libraries into landmines, monasteries into minefields, and the act of education into an existential risk, creating a twisted paradox where the light of knowledge became a death sentence. And perhaps that's the most sobering thought of all. How easily truth can be outlawed when fear wears the robe of righteousness. 2. Insulting the king or his property, disrespecting the monarch even, saying his horse was ugly was treated as treason. Jokes about royal appearance, attire, or family could lead to brutal public executions. Commoners faced burning. Nobles were sometimes beheaded, but if books could get you killed for what they contained, words spoken aloud could end you even faster, because in the medieval mind, treason didn't always involve weapons or secret meetings. Sometimes it involved nothing more than a poorly timed joke, an offhand comment, or the wrong opinion whispered in the wrong room. Because under medieval treason laws, there was no such thing as harmless banter. Every word was a thread, and pulling on the wrong one could unravel your life. It didn't matter if you weren't planning to overthrow the king. It didn't matter if you didn't have allies, swords, or plots. What mattered was that you questioned the appearance of royal authority. And in a world where divine rights ruled supreme, that meant you had committed heresy against God and sedition against the crown in a single breath. And the punishments were brutal not just in their pain, but in their pettiness. A man executed for mocking the king's beard, another for saying the monarch walked funny, and yet another for suggesting the royal garments looked like a peasant's patchwork. And each time the message was clear. The crown doesn't just govern your body, it governs your tongue, your tone, your thoughts. And once you understand that, you start to see the horror not just in the executions, but in the culture they created. Because everyone learned to speak with caution, to praise with excessive flourish, to cloak criticism in riddles or say nothing at all, and humor, once a relief valve in any society, became lethal, because satire didn't exist in these courts. Only insult punishable by fire, by rope, by steel, and perhaps even worse than the punishment was the surveillance, because medieval kings had something resembling secret police informants, spies, servants listening at doors, and even married couples weren't safe, since private conversations could be betrayed by a resentful servant, a jealous neighbor, or someone hoping to curry favor with the crown. And in this climate, silence was safety, and truth was a trap. So people learned to flatter, to bend their tongues, to lie if needed, to survive. And once again, women were disproportionately targeted, especially for gossip, because medieval society assumed that women, with their social circles and domestic roles, were the primary spreaders of mouth crimes, and the court treated their words not just as speech, but as contagion, dangerous, far-spreading, and requiring public execution as quarantine. And it all leads to the unavoidable realization that in this system, power didn't just want obedience, it wanted fear so thorough it rewired the way people communicated. And the tragedy is that it worked. It worked well, because when death hangs on every syllable, people stop speaking truth. That silence doesn't just protect the ruler, It dismantles the very possibility of resistance. 3. Disrupting church services. Even sneezing or coughing during Mass could be labeled blasphemy, punishable by death. Babies crying or worshippers nodding off were at risk. Charges were often politically motivated to remove rivals, and if punishing your voice wasn't cruel enough, the medieval world took it a step further by criminalizing even your involuntary reactions. Because in church, the one place that should have offered sanctuary, even a cough could condemn you. A sneeze could be seen as sabotage. And silence, absolute unbroken silence, was not just expected, was enforced with fire. Because medieval Christianity treated its rituals with such severity that any disruption, however minor, was labeled blasphemy, and blasphemy was a capital crime. So imagine standing shoulder to shoulder in a packed Easter service, air thick with incense, heat stifling, and knowing that if you cleared your throat at the wrong moment, it might be interpreted as mocking the divine, and that kind of scrutiny turned prayer into peril, because worship wasn't just about reverence, it was a test of control, and those who failed that test, sometimes literally because their child cried or they shifted in discomfort, were punished with death, usually burning, because the church didn't just want repentance. It wanted purification, and fire was the purifier of choice. And here again, the weight fell heaviest on women. Because women were expected not only to be quiet but invisible, their voices unwelcome, their movement restricted. And if a woman so much as murmured during a sermon, it could be construed as a challenge to the priest's authority, a challenge to doctrine, a crack in the wall of divine order. And so women learned not just to be silent, but to disappear inside themselves, and even that wasn't always enough. Because if your baby cried or your elderly mother slumped during a long reading, you might be accused of encouraging disruption, and it didn't help that church services were long, monotonous, and often crowded to the point of collapse during major holidays, making accidents inevitable. But in this world, accidents didn't exist on the offenses, and offenses were punished not with understanding but with spectacle, because public execution for religious disruption was designed to send a message that worship was not a privilege, it was a minefield, and anyone who stepped wrong would be made an example. And of course, behind all this piety was politics, because accusations of church disruption were often weaponized to eliminate rivals, with priests conveniently noticing disruptive behavior from opponents right before important ecclesiastical decisions. And these show trials weren't about blasphemy, they were about control, land, and influence, wrapped in robes and incense and holy fury. And in that sense, the church became not just a place of spiritual instruction, but a stage on which fear played its most theatrical role, reminding everyone that even their involuntary human functions could be criminal if the wrong person was watching. 4. Wearing the wrong color or fabric. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. Violations meant death. Purple or silk were reserved for elites. Even too many buttons could be a crime. Women were disproportionately targeted, and traveling made violations more likely. And just when you think medieval executions couldn't get more absurd, we reach a point where fashion itself became fatal, where fabric wasn't just clothing, it was a weaponized symbol of class, status, and rebellion. Because, in this twisted hierarchy, wearing the wrong color could quite literally cost you your life, thanks to sumptuary laws that governed what people could wear based on their social rank. And these laws weren't polite suggestions or guidelines, they were rigid, punishable edicts, and their enforcement was ruthless. So if a merchant wore purple, a color reserved for royalty, or if a peasant dared to line his tunic with silk, that was considered not a fashion faux pas, but a criminal act of ambition, an insult to the God-ordained social order, and medieval authorities reacted accordingly with execution, often public and humiliating, as if to say, "How dare you try to look like someone you're not?" And it wasn't just colors, it was buttons, it was lace, it was trim and thread count, and every detail of your attire was a statement to the state, a declaration of where you stood, and more importantly, where you didn't. And so fashion became a form of surveillance, with roving inspectors checking garments against legal charts, stopping people in marketplaces, outside churches, and in taverns to measure hems, count buttons, and test fabrics with their fingers, and if your clothing exceeded your station, you were arrested, tried, and often executed, not because your coat harmed anyone, but because it hinted at upward mobility. And in a society desperate to preserve inherited privilege, aspiration was dangerous, and here again, women bore the brunt, because female dress codes were far more complex, more policed, and more politicized than men's. And a woman who wore a dress deemed too fine could be accused not just of vanity, but of seduction, of subversion, of acting above her station and, often, of witchcraft, especially if she was unmarried or financially independent. So the dress became a silent battleground, a thread-wrapped minefield, and wealthy peasants who tried to navigate the system cleverly by dressing their servants in fine clothes to proxy their own prestige, often paid with their lives when authorities caught on, executing both servant and master, sending a clear message: fashion is not self-expression, it's feudal obedience. Stitched in fear, and the cruelest irony is that what might have been legal in one region could get you killed in another, because these laws varied wildly from one lord's domain to the next, meaning that a traveler dressed appropriately in his home village could ride into his death simply by crossing a border in the wrong cape, proving once again that in the medieval world even your clothing could be a death sentence. 5. Owning certain birds, especially falcons. Falconry was a noble exclusive right. Peasants caught with unauthorized birds could be executed. Bird ownership laws were strictly enforced, with trained inspectors monitoring violations. Killing or harming a noble's falcon was treated as treason, but if wearing the wrong outfit could lead you to the gallows, owning the wrong animal could be even worse. Because in medieval Europe, birds weren't just pets or companions. They were tools of status, warfare, and political identity, and nowhere was this more absurdly strict than in the world of falconry, where the ownership of a particular species of bird could mean the difference between nobility and noose, because falcons were reserved for the elite, and the laws around them were so meticulously enforced that even touching the wrong bird could mark you for execution. And the reasoning was as paranoid as it was calculated. Falcons were not just symbols of prestige, they were instruments of power used in hunting, in training, and in ceremonial displays of dominance. And so letting a commoner own a falcon was viewed as arming the unworthy, as opening the gates to social disorder, and to prevent that, medieval society created an entire class of falcon inspectors, people who roamed from village to village verifying bird permits, species identification, and ownership claims, and if they found you with an unauthorized bird, you could be imprisoned, tortured, or publicly executed in front of your peers. And not only that, if you killed or even accidentally harmed a noble's falcon, you might be drawn and quartered, a punishment so grisly and public that it was reserved for traitors, and this alone tells you how high falcons ranked in the medieval social ladder. Some birds were legally worth more than human lives. And the deeper you look into it, the more you see the madness of it all, because falconry knowledge itself was a form of restricted capital, passed down through noble families like a trade secret, unavailable to the poor, unteachable to the unworthy. And it wasn't just about the birds, it was about the idea that some skills, some pleasures, some freedoms were never meant to be shared. And so when a peasant boy caught a hawk or tried to train a kestrel, he wasn't just breaking a law, he was violating a worldview, one that said nature itself belonged to the powerful. And the enforcement was brutal because the fear was real. Not fear of birds, but fear of the social mobility they represented. Because if a peasant could fly a falcon like a lord, what else might he dare to do? And once again, women weren't exempt from these rules. In fact, noble women who trained birds were often restricted in what species they could own, their rights curtailed even within the noble class. A reminder that patriarchy transcended privilege, and in that world, even a feather out of place could spell your end. 6. Surviving your own execution. Cheating death didn't earn freedom in many cases. It led to repeated attempts or worse torture. Some regions required you to survive 5 executions to be pardoned. Survival was interpreted either as divine intervention or defiance of God's will. And if the laws of the Middle Ages weren't cruel enough in life, they found ways to be even crueler in death, because for some unfortunate souls, even dying wasn't enough to escape punishment, especially if you didn't die the way the system intended, because in this twisted landscape of ritual and power, surviving your own execution could be considered not a miracle, but a crime, and it raises a question that almost defies belief. What happens when someone cheats death in a world that believes death is divinely mandated? And the answer, unsurprisingly, is more death. Because in many medieval regions, if you survived your hanging, your burning, your beheading, or whatever gruesome method they had chosen for you, you weren't celebrated, you were condemned again. And not because you broke a law, but because you undermined divine justice. And that wasn't just inconvenient, it was blasphemous. Because executions were seen as holy rituals, as enactments of heavenly will, and if a person survived, it meant one of 2 things, though God had intervened, or the devil had. And neither option gave the authorities any peace, so instead of releasing the survivor, they tried again, sometimes over and over, because some laws required that you survive multiple executions 5 in some places before you were officially pardoned. But those pardons were rare, and often came too late to matter. And part of the problem was the crude technology of the time ropes broke. Axes missed, fires sputtered, and executioners, often undertrained or deliberately bribed, made mistakes. And when that happened, the system panicked. Not because they feared legal consequences, but because they feared looking weak, and in medieval justice, appearance was everything, so instead of stopping, they doubled down, calling for more force, more punishment, more certainty, and if a man had to be hung twice, or an old woman burned again, so be it. Truth didn't matter, only compliance, and sometimes this created surreal legal debates over whether surviving was a sign of innocence or guilt, whether a failed execution proved divine mercy or demonic resistance, and in those debates, theology became law, and law became a hammer with no handle, swinging blindly at anyone who dared to not die correctly. And here again, the system saved its worst for the poor, because the wealthy had resources, bribes, connections, political leverage that could turn a botched execution into exile. But for everyone else, surviving meant more pain, more humiliation, and often a slower, more torturous end, because no one was allowed to outlive the power of the gallows. 7. Stealing bread. Even starving people, including children, were executed for stealing food. The crime was often over moldy scraps, showing a complete lack of compassion. Communities lived in fear and refused to share food to avoid. Implication, and now we arrive at a form of punishment so grotesque, so coldly detached from reason, that it strips away any illusion that medieval justice was about justice at Albuquerque, in a time when people were starving, when children cried themselves to sleep from hunger, when families rationed crusts of moldy bread. The crime that could get you executed was stealing food, not from the royal kitchens or the granaries of lords, but from trash piles, from market stalls, from the crumbs that others had thrown away. And the punishment wasn't a warning or a whipping, it was hanging. Public, brutal, and final, and the justification was as shallow as it was sadistic. Because rather than address the poverty, the famine, the desperate circumstances that drove people to steal bread, the authorities chose to make examples of them, to teach the public that hunger was no excuse, that property mattered more than life, and so gallows were erected in town squares. And people gathered not for pity but for spectacle, to watch a starving woman swing for taking a loaf, to see a child, yes, a child, as young as 7 tied by the neck and lifted until the air stopped, because the law had no age limit, only priorities, and food theft, however desperate, was seen as a disruption of order, a challenge to the idea that some people had everything while others had nothing. And this wasn't about bread, it was about hierarchy, about protecting the power of landowners and merchants, about preserving the myth that poverty was a result of laziness, not of systemic cruelty, and so they made the punishment visible, public, horrifying, so that the next hungry family would hesitate, would suffer in silence, would watch their child starve rather than steal. And communities, terrified of being implicated, stopped sharing food. Neighbors who once helped each other turned away, because giving food to someone who stole could make you complicit, and complicity, too, was a crime. And what emerged from this was not justice but fear, not order but silence, a silence that let people rot in alleyways while the bakers' shelves stayed full, and the kings feasted under golden chandeliers. And the most sickening part is that these were not rare cases. Records showed dozens, hundreds, of executions for petty food theft, each one a tragedy, each one a symptom of a world so deeply broken that the smallest attempt to survive could get you killed. And the moral, as always, was clear. It's not the crime they feared, it was the survival of the people they refused to feed. 8. Growing forbidden plants. Plants linked to witchcraft or medicine, like nightshade or mandrake, could result in being burned alive. Elderly women with knowledge of herbs were prime targets. Some banned plants were actually healing herbs. Church and state monopolized their cultivation, and if stealing bread to survive could get you hanged, then planting the wrong flowers in your garden could get you burned alive, because in medieval Europe, even your backyard was a battlefield, and your garden wasn't just a place to grow food or herbs, it was a place where suspicion took root, where the wrong plant, the wrong leaf, the wrong bloom could mark you for death, because certain plants, mandrake, henbane, nightshade, were considered not just poisonous, but possessed, believed to be tools of witchcraft, evidence of sorcery, gateways to the demonic. And in a time where science had no seat at the table, where medicine and magic were often confused, the presence of these plants could turn a healer into a heretic, and the flames followed fast, because it didn't matter if you were growing them for pain relief or spiritual ritual. or if they were passed down from your grandmother's recipe book, the very act of cultivating forbidden plants was enough to ignite suspicion. And in a world ruled by fear, suspicion was all that was needed, and this paranoia turned every green thumb into a potential threat, especially if that green thumb belonged to a woman, because women again were disproportionately targeted, not only because they were more likely to be herbalists, midwives, or caretakers, but because they were already assumed to be vessels of temptation, of chaos, of disorder. And so when a woman lived alone and knew which roots eased childbirth, or which leaves soothed fever, or which flowers grew near graves, it didn't make her a healer, it made her dangerous, and authorities used this fear to justify constant garden inspections, targeting widows, midwives, elderly women who had survived their usefulness to a system that only valued them for labor or childbirth, and the execution was nearly always fire. Because fire didn't just kill, it cleansed, and in the twisted eyes of the medieval clergy, fire was God's mouth, devouring the ungodly from the earth. And the tragedy deepens when you realize that many of the plants banned for being witchy were actually medicinal, substances that could heal, treat infection, reduce inflammation, plants we now know have real value, outlawed not because they were dangerous but because the power to heal was supposed to belong to the church or the crown, not the peasant woman with dirt on her hands and wisdom in her bones. And in trying to control that power, they chose to burn it out of existence, leaving ash where there had once been knowledge, and terror where there had once been healing. 9. Being an old woman, aging women were vulnerable to witchcraft accusations, especially if they lived alone. Older women were seen as economically useless and often scapegoated during crises. Torture and burning were standard methods of execution, but perhaps the cruelest crime of all, the one that required no action, no speech, no possession or intent, was simply being an old woman, because in the brutal accounting of the medieval world, age wasn't wisdom, it was weakness, suspicion, and eventually a liability, and for women especially, growing old could be its own death sentence, not because they committed a crime, but because they were no longer useful to the systems that had once relied on their labor, their fertility, their silence, and once that perceived usefulness ended, all that remained was suspicion, and that suspicion, like a creeping vine, grew quickly, feeding on every misfortune that passed through a village. A spoiled crop, a dying cow, a fever that lingered to long end when people looked for a scapegoat. They didn't look up, they looked across the lane, at the woman with grey in her hair and no man by her side, the one who lived alone, who whispered to her cat, who remembered old songs no one else sang anymore, and they said her name like a curse. And from that whisper to the fire was often a very short walk, because the accusation of witchcraft required no evidence, only fear, and once accused, the outcome was all but guaranteed, because these trials weren't about truth, they were about removing burdens, cleansing communities, seizing property, and reminding everyone what happened to women who outlived their roles. And so torture became routine, confessions coerced under unimaginable pain, not because they were true, but because they were required. And if you confessed quickly, you died slightly faster. But if you resisted, you had the audacity to deny your guilt. They made sure your end was not only slow, but spectacular, a warning baked into every flame. And it wasn't coincidence that these purges often happened during times of economic strain or political tension. Because when resources dwindled and morale dipped, what better way to reset the balance than by blaming the woman who no longer bore children, who no longer served a master, who dared to survive? And what makes it worse is that these women were often the keepers of ancient knowledge. Midwives, herbalists, storytellers, the living libraries of their communities, and their loss wasn't just human. It was cultural, a severing of wisdom passed down through generations, burned away in fear and ignorance and greed. And so their deaths weren't just executions, they were erasures, wiping clean the inconvenient memory that women could age with dignity, that they could matter without marriage, that they could exist beyond silence. 10. Refusing to confess. Silence was interpreted as defiance. Victims were pressed to death with stones or tortured until they confessed. Some refused to speak to protect their family's property. Torture methods included sleep deprivation, water torture, and prolonged crushing. And if being old, alone, or educated could put a woman on the path to the stake, then saying nothing at all could deliver the final blow, because in the twisted logic of medieval justice, silence wasn't a defense, it was defiance. And the courts had a special kind of punishment reserved for those who refused to confess, even under duress, because refusal to speak was treated not as fear, but as rebellion, not as self-preservation, but as an insult to divine and royal authority. And in England and other parts of Europe, that refusal earned you a punishment so deliberately cruel it has no modern parallel, was called peine forte et dure. And it meant being slowly crushed to death under the weight of heavy stones, layer upon layer, until your bones snapped, your organs ruptured, or your will gave in, whichever came first. And if it sounds medieval, that's because this was not just torture, it was legal theatre, a process designed to break you physically and spiritually, to turn your silence into a kind of spectacle. Because a guilty plea meant you lost your property to the crown, but if you died without confessing, your estate could go to your family. So some chose to remain silent, not out of bravery, but out of love, out of desperation to protect the people they would leave behind. And the authorities knew this, and they hated it, because it denied them their full victory. So they pressed harder, sometimes literally, using boards and weights and public ceremony to make your silence seem like stubbornness, like guilt, like proof, because in a world where confession was the only acceptable outcome, resistance was a kind of heresy, and those who endured it were treated like demons in human form, especially if they were women, because female silence was seen as unnatural, even sinister, a sign not of strength, but of sorcery, of possession, of unholy influence. And so women who refused to speak were crushed faster, harder, more viciously, their silence painted as seduction, their endurance twisted into evil. And this was the final paradox of medieval justice, that even when you refused to play the game still crushed you, that even when you denied the charges, they made your denial part of the crime, and so whether you spoke or stayed silent, you were guilty by design. And that wasn't just law, that was control, the kind that makes truth irrelevant, that turns the process into the punishment, and the punishment into propaganda. And now, having descended through this grim catalogue of cruelty disguised as law, we're left staring into the bleak heart of medieval justice, not a system designed to protect the innocent, but to enforce obedience through terror, not a code of laws but a tapestry of paranoia, stitched together with fear, fire, and silence. Because what ties all these so-called crimes together? The reading, speaking, sneezing, aging, dressing, owning, surviving, planting, starving, refusing to confess. Not that they were harmful, but that they challenged control, that they made someone powerful feel uncomfortable, unsafe, or disrespected, and in that world, discomfort was punishable by death. And death wasn't just an ending, it was a warning, a billboard erected in the public square that said, "This is what happens when you cross the line," even when the line is invisible. And so people learned to shrink themselves, to edit their words, to bury their thoughts, to avoid books, fashion, conversation, and even kindness. Because kindness too could be fatal if shown to the wrong person. And what emerged from that was not justice but survival masquerading as virtue, a population trained to endure, not to live. And if it seems impossible that such a world could exist, remember, this it didn't collapse because of its absurdity. It endured for centuries, because fear, when systematized, is one of the most stable forms of power ever created. And the lesson here isn't just historical, it's present, because while we may not burn people for books or crush them for silence, today the mechanics of fear, control, and erasure still linger in quieter forms. Censorship disguised as protection, surveillance justified by safety, dignity traded for compliance, and memory rewritten to protect the reputations of the powerful. And that's why we tell these stories, not to mock the past, but to learn from it, not to gawk at their brutality, but to examine our own and to ask, what are the invisible lines today? Who draws them and who suffers when they're crossed? Because the strangest thing about the weirdest crimes of the Middle Ages isn't that they existed, how close some of them still feel, how fragile our freedoms remain when fear decides what's allowed. And that's why history matters, not because it's over, but because it's waiting to happen again, in different clothes, with new scripts, on a stage that's much larger, but lit by the same torches. The most terrifying thing about medieval executions wasn't the fire or the noose, was how easily ordinary life became criminal, how quickly silence was mistaken for guilt, how fiercely power protected itself, not with justice, but with spectacle, shame, and fear. This was a world where wearing the wrong color, reading the wrong word, or living too long could become a death sentence, not because of what you did, but because of what you represented. These weren't crimes. They were warnings to everyone else. And the deeper lesson is this: when the law becomes a tool for fear and survival depends on obedience to invisible rules, injustice doesn't look like chaos, it looks like order. If we want a different future, we must learn to recognize the quiet return of old ideas dressed in modern robes. Because history doesn't only haunt us with its horrors, it tests whether we're still paying attention.